Welcome to Shrinking Classics and Merry Christmas. After
Merry
all,
Christmas.
it's Christmas time, and so we are reading the old classic, A Christmas Carol. I read this every year, and now I'm going to read it and share my thoughts with some of you. And so I am Caleb Nelson. I have a bachelor's in psychology, and I'm so grateful that you are attending in whatever way you are, whether it's YouTube or Spotify or any other platform, that I'm so grateful you're here, that I am in spirit standing at your elbow. Just so grateful that I'm shaking your hand and giving you a hug if you like hugs.
Hi, I'm Leslie Nelson. I have the blessing of being Caleb's mom. And I think this is actually my first year actually reading A Christmas Carol. I've watched the movies many times, but I think it's actually my first time reading the book.
Great. Welcome to
And
the club.
I am wannabe ghost of present moments,
I
of
love that.
being in the present.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And that's actually a big part of what we're hoping to get across today is how A Christmas Carol isn't just a neat story about a guy who goes from a grumpy old man to a person who's a benefit to society, but it's about how that happens and why that happens and how with some practice we can turn our lives around as well. And that's the beauty of this book, is that it's not just about Scrooge. It's about the Scrooginess in each of us and about how we can all be able to change each and every day. And that's kind of what we hope to get across as we talk about this today. Would you
Yes,
agree?
absolutely. Absolutely. And before we jump in, can we just kind of put in a plug for reading reading the unabridged version?
Yes.
I didn't know that some of the versions are abridged. So I listened to on Audible this delightful version narrated by Patrick Stewart. I loved it. And then I mentioned to Caleb that, that was easy. It's only like an hour and a half. And you said, I think you read an abridged one. I didn't
Right.
know. They should have put that on the title, doggone it.
Absolutely. It should be more obvious, like, hey, this is shorter than normal.
Yeah, so I still really enjoyed that one, but then I read another one narrated by BJ Harrison,
Oh yeah,
the
he's good.
full length, and I like that even better. In fact, there were a couple questions that I had. Maybe they'll come up as we discuss the book, so I won't jump into that now. But there are a couple questions I had from the abridged one that were answered in the full length. So I think that you should leave Dickens as he is and not cheat and shorten him. But that's just my opinion.
Right.
So anyway, just mostly I want to let people know that be careful you don't get the abridged version if that's not what you're specifically looking for. If you are, that's cool too, but just good to make a decision knowing what what you're getting.
Yes, no, definitely. And because the thing is, if you want to read a shorter story, then go for it. But first, read the full version. Like for example, I read Les Mis, and I think next time I read it, I will try for the abridged one just to see what the difference is. But with Christmas Carol is, at least in my copy, it's only 120 pages. You don't need to abridge 120 pages. You just need to read 120 pages because there's so much good information and good stuff in the full version that gets cut out in an abridged version just because people are are more focused on the story than the content of the book itself. So it's like people are trying it's the abridged ones are for people who like A Christmas Carol, whereas A Christmas Carol is for people who like the story written by Charles Dickens, because we'll get into a little bit about why there's an abridged version just throughout the our discussion of the book, because Dickens, he loves his words, and I think that's part of why I really love Charles Dickens, is because he goes through great lengths to describe the most kind of ordinary things, and he makes the ordinary things feel extraordinary, and that's just so kind. So you gotta read the full version at least once. If you choose to stick with the abridged after that, that's on you, and that's no problem. But at least
And
start with the first.
the full version might answer any lingering questions you have, like it did for
Yes,
me.
exactly. Well, let's see. So then, without further ado, let's just jump into it. What do you say?
Let's do it.
All right.
Let's do it.
So the opening line, I think that's pretty much paramount and it's fundamental in every version, is Marley was dead to begin with. There's no doubt whatever about that. It's just, just straightforward. You know what's going on, you know that he's dead. And then Charles Dickens goes on, he explains about how if if he likens it to Hamlet and how if Hamlet's father wasn't really dead, then what would the story be about? And like, yeah, so there is more information than you need there, but that's Charles Dickens. But if you read the abridged, then you'll I almost guarantee that you'll miss one of my favorite. I don't want to call it useless, but pointless, for a lack of a better word. Um, it's just such a good paragraph. Let me read it for you. It says it says old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't know. I don't mean to say I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade, but the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hand shall not disturb it, or else the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. It's just like, what's the point of that? I don't know, but it's funny and I enjoy it.
I think it's funny, and I like just a very vulnerable. He's like, just having a conversation with a friend in this book. Like we're just sitting down to dinner, and he's telling you a story. I love it.
That's true, and that is like I didn't think about it like that, but that is honestly what it feels like. Is throughout the whole story is it just feels like Charles Dickens is just telling his buddies a story, and this story was one of the ones that kind of helped him kind of get back into the swing of things as a writer and an author, and so it's just what a great story. So, anywho, that's just something that I think about every time I think about Christmas Carol is about the coffin nail versus the doornail. But when it all comes down to it, the point still comes into that it's a story about when Scrooge's partner Marley died. Actually, 7 years passed on Christmas Eve, and Scrooge, just being Scrooge, he never changed the name of the shop. He just didn't really move on with his life because his life wasn't going anywhere anyways. And And then one day Marley comes to him and tells him, like, hey, look, you've got to change your ways or you are in for a world of hurt like me. Because the way that you're living your life is you are building these chains of which you're going to drag forever because uh, that's just how Charles Dickens kind of viewed the afterlife, at least in this book, is that we, and I think Marley says this, is that we forged our chains in life that we'll have to carry after we die, and you forge your chain by all the bad things you do and all the good opportunities missed. You forge your chain of guilt and regret. And so you got to be careful about what you're forging while you're living. You have any thoughts?
Yeah. Oh, I was just gonna say, I love
Yeah,
the part I was looked really quickly, see if I can find it, but I couldn't. Where he just his description of Marley, how he unwraps this handkerchief around his head and his jaw just drops down.
right.
And then after they get done talking, he puts it back on, the handkerchief back on, and Scrooge can hear the jaw snap back into place. It
Yes.
just cracks me up. Like that is a great description. And anyway, so launching in, one of the things that we had talked about a little bit was about mindfulness in the story. And the first time I noticed it was here in this conversation with Marley. So I'd like to share this part right here. So they're talking, and Marley says, "You don't believe in me," and Scrooge is like, "I don't." Why not? Because, said Scrooge, a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are. And here's the mindfulness thing.
Yes, one of my favorite lines.
Isn't that great? Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow of his bones. So he's making jokes to distract himself, to avoid his feelings. And mindfulness in its very essence is about sitting with your feelings and being in the moment you're in. So right off the bat, Dickens is telling us that Scrooge, I don't think this is a new thing. This is something he habitually does. If there's something he doesn't want to think about, I mean, that's what I interpret from that, that he is going to do something to distract himself.
Right. And I totally agree. And it all comes it all kind of fits together as we get into stave 2 or chapter 2 when we start talking about Scrooge's past. And it's kind of brief, but there is a lot packed in to that whole section about how he never learned to deal with his emotions and how he's uh, always he has an avoidant kind of style or an avoidant attachment style, and how he's always what's the term? He's always oh shoot. Wow, I'm totally spacing on it. It's
It'll come
well,
back to you in a minute.
yeah, it'll come back later. But and it's just fascinating to see how like it's such a condensed, small little glimpse into a man's life, but you can see the effects that it has. And so yeah, so I think the best thing to do is right here in the beginning is we talk a little bit about Scrooge and how Scrooge is Scrooge and like just his present actions. For example, he talks about how when the men come to collect some charity from him, and he just outright just kind of just basically tells them to get lost, and he says, you know what, if my taxes aren't covering enough of the prisons and the workhouses, I don't know what you're doing here, because I'm not going to give you any money. If there's a surplus population, then they might as well just die and let us move on, which is another way of him avoiding problems. He's not allowing himself to actually like be in the moment and say, you know what, maybe there are people who are really struggling and I'm not struggling and I could help them. But instead he just says, you know what, they should be able to deal with themselves or die. That's what I would do. He said that's basically what he's saying, is that if it was up to me, I would die rather than get help from somebody else. But it's
Oh,
not
yeah. And a
about him.
way to avoid the uncomfortable feelings of feeling someone else's pain,
Right.
right? Just going to push it off and not feel that.
Right. And blame somebody else. Says that
Yeah.
it's not my fault that I don't want to give up my money. It's the surplus population's fault for being alive, which is just terrible.
Right. He's so mean.
And then when Fred comes, Fred is like the most kind person, and that's the point, is that Dickens is trying to tell us that Scrooge is so hardened. He says at one point that Scrooge is like an old flint from which no one had ever had no one had ever sparked generous fire, which I just think is clever, because there's nothing generous about Scrooge. And he even talks about how the rains could even boast over Scrooge that they at least come down handsomely, whereas Scrooge never did. And so there's just so much about Scrooge that just shows that he's so self-focused that he's not willing to get out of his own bubble. He's not willing to get out of his head and experience anything around him. Because then as the moment that something tries to kind of nudge his way into his psyche, if you would, he just immediately pushes it out, which is the opposite of mindfulness, which my mom did a good job of bringing up, because that is mindfulness, is being in the moment with whatever you're in right now, whether it's good or bad or sad or you're scared, whether you're anxious, you let yourself be in that moment, at least for some time. You don't just brush it off. Would you agree?
Exactly.
Am
And
I going down the right trail here?
oh, absolutely. I think, and I think it's understandable. It's kind of human nature that we want to avoid comfortable emotions. But what people
Sorry,
don't
can you
realize
say that
is,
again? You kind of cut out for a minute.
oh, yeah, I think it's human nature to try and avoid the uncomfortable emotions, whatever they are, stress or depression or anxiety, anger, whatever. And you try to push it down and bury it. And the more intense the feeling is, the more we try to avoid it. But the whole idea of mindfulness is to just sit with that feeling and allow yourself to feel it. And when you do that, then the feelings, often you can work through them and they'll go away. Whereas if you try to avoid them, then they're just there dogging you like a shadow. It actually, doing that actually makes the feelings more powerful. Like I always like to say, it's like mushrooms, they thrive and grow in the dark. And
Right.
so I think Scrooge, by trying to avoid his difficult feelings, is a big part of why he's become this angry, miserly, bitter person. Because the more he tries to avoid feeling anything uncomfortable, the more miserable he becomes. It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And he uses money as an escape. Is that his focus on greed and money is an escape from real human feelings. Business is his escape, which him and Marley talk about that. Scrooge says, "It wasn't my business to know about all these people's problems. It's not my business to help these other people." And Marley famously says, "Humankind is our business." And that's where Scrooge gets it wrong, is he gets so focused on the greed and the money. Like I mentioned in the last podcast, Charles Dickens, he has this kind of disdain for money due to due to his life. He has just all these different situations where it was not helpful to him. And so he'll often throw something in his books about how money corrupts people and how it's not something to be sought after. And Scrooge is a great example of this, is that he gets so focused on money as an escape that his whole life crumbles, and he lives alone, and he's he's essentially clinically probably depressed. Like he wouldn't say he is, but he doesn't enjoy anything. That's anhedonia. He doesn't like anything. And he doesn't have friends. He doesn't get out of the house except for to go to business or work. And so he just has a miserable life. But in the book, it says that, what does it say? It says that his house was always dark, and because the darkness was cheap, and Scrooge liked it. And it also says that the cold was cheap and that he liked it. So it's just he likes things that were cheap because it's a way that he doesn't spend money. So focused on money that all aspects of his life suffer, if you could
And that
call it a
he'll even,
life.
even be in the dark, like both by not the lights, but also emotionally,
Right.
because he's so focused on money and
Yeah,
avoidance.
exactly. And now, so is there anything else you wanted to go over in stave one, or should we move on to the Ghost of Christmas Past?
Oh no, let's go to Christmas past. I'm
All
ready.
right. Okay, so the Ghost of Christmas Past, this is where my little note about being at your elbow comes in. When the Ghost of Christmas Past is introduced, then Charles Dickens explains it as the Ghost of Christmas Past opened up the curtains and was so close to Scrooge that he was about as close as Charles Dickens is to us. And in spirit, he was standing at our elbow, which again, it's just something that makes it feel like Charles Dickens is trying to be our friend in this story, which is just delightful. But now, so to the point, the past. We always have this view of the past, at least there's at least a couple of different ways to view the past. One is the glory days, the good old days, even though, I mean, they weren't that great. They were just like any other days. So you either have the glory days or you have kind of the dark past that you don't want to remember, or maybe you just don't really remember and think about that often. And all of those are different. But for Scrooge, he has the dark past that he chooses to shun and not remember. And that's because a lot of the things that made him the greedy, selfish man he is today come up from trauma that he hasn't dealt with in the past because he wasn't being mindful. He was, anytime a uncomfortable thought comes up for him, he shuts it down and he says, you know what? Nope, nope, we're not doing this. And he focuses on counting money or something boring. So,
Counting money. Yeah.
all right. So now a big question that I always have while I'm reading Christmas Carol is why is Scrooge so Scroogey, you know? And because I mean, it's the psychology in me. This the bachelor's in psychology that I'm like, okay, great. Well, he's this terrible person, but why? What made him that way? And as I mentioned before, is that we get a little glimpse. So when the ghost of Christmas past takes him to his past, he sees a little boy who's alone and neglected by his friends, sitting at a desk at his boarding school. And you pick up a lot in that sentence, but I'll come back to that after I finish this scenario, which is when his little sister Fran comes in and is just super kind to him and loves him and tells him how great it is that that their dad is actually letting Scrooge come home for Christmas this year, and that he's been so kind lately that it's almost like heaven, which shows you a lot of things. And that's what we'll kind of break down is, so the things you can pick up in here is that Scrooge's mom died. And so Scrooge's mom died when he was a young age, and that's always traumatic. You also pick up that Scrooge's father was abusive, whether it was physically or verbally, he was still abusive. He was abusive to young Scrooge, and sent Scrooge away to boarding school, so didn't want to have anything to do with him. And then even Scrooge's peers neglected him and didn't want to be around him. And so now that recipe is going to cause some serious problems in the future if he doesn't get any help, if there's nothing that he can find that can help him, or there's nobody who can work with him. Uh, and one of the major roles of parents is to teach their children how to deal with their emotions. And so clearly, Scrooge's father didn't teach him how to deal with his emotions, and Scrooge's mother died, and so she didn't get that opportunity. And so little Scrooge was left to try to figure out how to deal with his emotions. And as we learn, he didn't really figure it out. And that's not his fault. It's hard to deal with your emotions, especially if you don't have someone who's been there and been able to experience them and has pro tips and advice. What are your thoughts on all this? Did you see this when you read through it, or what are you thinking?
Oh, yeah. I was definitely thinking along the same lines that he had a very difficult childhood. I mean, rejected by his father. His mother wasn't able to be there for him. And those preliminary, life experiences really influence you and affect you as an adult. And people can say, oh, well, just forget about that. Let it go. Don't dwell on the past. But that those first experiences really, affect you, formulate the whole wiring of your brain and how
Right.
you see the world. And you can't just throw that away, you know, it's not
Yeah,
possible.
absolutely. And so that just shows that Scrooge, he already kind of had a rough start. And so now we get to follow him through his life a little bit more and see as things go. What you learn is that Fran, the basically the ray of light in his life, his sister, who I assume was like his mother and someone that he loved and who loved him back, she dies early too. And but she did have a son, and her son is Fred. And so I think there could be some kind of feelings about how he doesn't want to get close to Fred because he's afraid that for some reason Fred will also leave him. So we start to see that he's forming I believe it's called an avoidant attachment style, where he's afraid of getting in a relationship because he just thinks that everyone's going to end up leaving him in the end. And so I'm going to skip over Mr. Fezziwig a little bit because Mr. Fezziwig just shows that he did have good moments, and it was kind of a ray of light, almost as if it was a positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of the dance like moons. I don't know what that means, but you know what I do know? is that it shows that Scrooge had a little ray of light, even if it was from the moons of Mr. Fezziwig's calves. He had a moment that he had a chance to be able to turn his life around and learn from his mentor, Mr. Fezziwig, that you can give back and have a good life by spending money on people and showing them that you care about them. And I think that Mr. Fezziwig became a role model for him by the end of the book. But unfortunately, he wasn't emotionally mature enough to be able to deal with his past trauma. And so this ray of light got pushed down, just like everything else, when the hard times started to come. And uh, I guess before I skip on, is there anything that you wanted to add about Mr. Fezziwig and that whole experience?
Uh, I agree with you. I think that was a good ray of light for him. I think it just wasn't quite enough to overcome the darkness, basically, of his
Yeah,
experiences with his father and losing his mom. But it was, a little seed, like you said, to grow into something later with the help of the ghosts and Marley.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And so then we'll skip right over into uh the last part that we'll talk about, at least that I had planned to talk about, which is Scrooge actually found a girl. So that's cool. Good for him. But also not
Right.
so much, because as Scrooge got into a deeper relationship with this woman, then he began to self-sabotage. And I think this is due to his avoidant attachment style. I believe that's the right word. I could be wrong. Effectively, what I'm trying to say and get across is that Scrooge has a underlying fear that everyone in his life is going to leave him. And I think especially the women in his life, because when you lose your mom from a young age, then your mom is someone who you look to as kind of your future spouse in a sense. If you think of the Freudian uh, Oedipus complex, which doesn't mean that you view your mom sexually. It just means that you view your mom as somebody that you respect and somebody that you and like someone you hope will be able to love you in the future, so that you set them as a role model. And if that role model dies from an early age, then that means that you no longer have that. And so that can make it so that you're afraid that anyone else in the future will go away. But see, it wasn't just Scrooge's mom, it was also his sister. So his sister died, and so now he's had two fundamental women in his life die and leave him. And that sets him up to be pretty unstable in relationships. And we see that when he is in his relationship with, I don't even think she has a name in the story, because I think he just blocked it out in a sense. And so, but when he's in this relationship, he's engaged, but the lady, she calls off the engagement because she says that a new idol has replaced her, a golden idol. And essentially it was the greed. Is Scrooge started to use money and greed and self-sabotage. So he got so fixated on the money that he let his relationship die. And he didn't fix it because he was too afraid that she was going to leave him anyways. That's at least kind of my understanding on that. What do you think?
I never thought of it that way before, but now that you mention it, I think you're spot on. I think it was really more about that, his attachment issues, than the money. I think he did pull away from her. It's probably, subconscious, but yeah, I think he definitely pulled away from her out of fear. I
Right.
think that's a really good observation. I hadn't thought about that. I like it.
Yeah,
I
and I
agree.
and I think he didn't even do it intentionally. It was a subconscious. He's just like, you know what? He's like, this is going so great that is probably going to end in disaster, and I'm just gonna. But I don't want to end it, so I'm just gonna focus on money. I'm gonna be non-mindful and push out the
Right.
things that are good in my life and focus on these things that I can control. Which, if he was focusing on better things, that'd be a good mindset,
That makes sense because that's one of the problems when we block out the bad things, we also block the good ones.
right?
You it just it's a bummer, but Yeah, you block all the bad feelings, you also block good ones.
Yeah. No, it's true. It's your brain, it has a hard time filtering memories when you're trying to when you're blocking the past. It has a hard time just saying, okay, well, I want to keep these ones. It's like, you want to block the past? Okay, we're putting up a door. Like, what do you want me to do? Can't just put windows in the door. You'll still see the bad little guys back there too.
Right.
So, and so yeah, so that's my understanding of Scrooge and how Scrooge became Scroogey, is that he started to fear that everybody that was important to him was going to leave him anyways, and so he just pushed them out of his life, and which is really tragic, especially because I think he doesn't even realize he did that, and so he still thinks that everybody else pushed that everybody left
That they
him.
left him.
Right. So he's
Hmm.
the victim here. And so naturally then he's just gonna have a disdain for people because why does everybody mistreat him? Like all of the friends in his childhood, well, the lack of friends in his childhood and his father, his potential relationships. And that's just the few examples we see. And so Scrooge views himself as a victim because he doesn't realize that he's not being mindful and therefore he's self-sabotaging. It's self-sabotage is kind of like when you have a big test coming up and instead of studying really hard, you procrastinate. Procrastination is a form of self-sabotage because what it does is it gives you an excuse. Because then when you take the test and you get a bad score, you say, oh man, I should have just studied. Then I would have done great. Because if you studied and you did everything you could and you still got a bad score, then you're like, oh, maybe I'm just not smart or I'm just not good at this. And so sometimes your brain will trick you and say, well, then let's just not worry about it. That's self-sabotaging. And Scrooge does this. He absolutely does this. And it's how his relationship falls apart. And it's how I believe most relationships fall apart is that we self-sabotage. We don't realize we're doing it. We say, like a lot of people I understand, they'll say, I thought my marriage was great, or I thought my relationship was great, but the other person didn't. And it's because we don't realize the stuff that we aren't looking at. We don't realize that, oh, I guess I am spending a lot more time playing video games than I am being with my wife, or whatever it may be. That's a form of self-sabotage. So be careful. That's all I'm trying to say here is that we could end up as Scrooge. Though Scrooge is an extreme example. The point is that Scrooge had these moments and there's some danger in it.
Okay, I agree with you about the self-sabotage. And I also think this goes back to also what we're talking about earlier about the spiral. The more now he's more lonely and, more miserable. And that makes him more miserable in turn. And he hates people more. And the more he hates people, the more miserable he is. And it just is like this vicious spiral down to the Scrooge we meet at the beginning of the
Right.
story.
Yeah, exactly. And so now with all the doom and gloom of the past, if you would, then uh I suppose we skip right ahead and jump into stave 3 and talk about the ghost of Christmas present. Does that sound good to you? We're good to
Oh yeah,
move
let's do it.
forward? Good.
Yeah.
So we got the setup. We got like, oh man, poor Scrooge and I guess poor all of us. But what do we do about that? So Ghost of Christmas Present, the Jolly Giant. Come in and know me better, man. What a great if you could encapsulate mindfulness, I might choose come in and know me better, man. That I just feel like that's so fitting. And you can say it about your perspective on other people, or you can say it about your perspective on yourself. Is that mindfulness is all about either getting to know yourself better, or getting to know the moment better, or getting to know the person you're with better. So come in and know me better, man. What do you have to say on that? I feel like you're the one that got me into mindfulness. So this is kind of your show now, right? At least for this stage. So no pressure.
No pressure. Yeah, I do. I like that idea, the come in and know me better, man. That's that's awesome. And obviously the ghost of Christmas present is part of, it because mindfulness is all about being in the moment that you're in. which is a very simple way to put it. One of the things I love about mindfulness is it's very simple and it's also very complex, you
Right.
know? And so there's so much about this part that I love. But also, I'm thinking of Tiny Tim,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
how his mindfulness, like when they went to church and he's like, I hope the people see me and maybe it'll make them happy to think about how Jesus healed the lepers.
Right.
He clearly wasn't trying to avoid his moment that he was in. He was embracing it and finding something good in it. I think that's awesome and amazing.
Yeah. No, that's true.
Not
And
that
even
you
just
always have to do that.
right.
Sometimes you just need to allow yourself to feel sad for a little while,
That's
you
true.
know?
It's true. You can't just kind of wish the sadness away. That's not being mindful. Being mindful is saying, you
Right.
know what? Sadness, you're here, and that's cool. We can be sad for
Right.
a little bit, and you're a totally valid emotion, and you have a place. And so I'll let you be in that place for some time. And and we're talking about Tiny Tim, so we'll just talk about the Cratchits in general. What this makes me think of is when Scrooge was talking to Fred in the beginning, and Scrooge says, "What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." And then Fred says, "Oh, well, what reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough." And which is all to say that, economic standing doesn't have a place in your joy if you are able to be mindful and enjoy what you have. And the Cratchit family is a perfect example of this. It's a funny way that Charles Dickens describes the feast that, if you could call it that, what that the Cratchits have. It talks all about how things are so humble, but Dickens describes them in a way as if they were grand. And that's because that's how the Cratchits view it, is that they're a very poor family who's not paid enough by Scrooge, and he is the ogre of the family, as the book says. But still at the end is they still toast to Mr. Scrooge's health, because, as Bob Cratchit says, to Scrooge, the founder of the feast. And all the family, they kind of have a hard time with that phrase, because they're like, the founder of the feast, he barely pays us anything. But at the same time, they took a moment, they were mindful of Scrooge and the good and bad that he brings, and they took a moment to be mindful of that, and then they moved on, and they all had fun as a family. They played games, they sang songs, but they were all together in the moment. They weren't thinking about what their neighbors had, they were just thinking about what they had, which I think is also a beautiful example of mindfulness.
Yeah, and like the dad, Cratchit, Bob Cratchit, he wasn't thinking about, oh, tomorrow I got to go back to work with Scrooge
Right.
or yesterday Scrooge was so rude. No, he just enjoyed the time that he had with his family being in that moment.
Right.
I also love their feast, how, they really appreciate their beautiful was enough to eat and like satisfy their hunger, which kind of implies that often there isn't. They eat a meal and they're still hungry because there's not
Right.
enough, you know. So I just think it's so that they're just also kind of mindfulness that they're just grateful for right now, today there was enough to eat. We're not going to think about yesterday when we went to bed hungry or tomorrow when we might go to bed hungry. I'm just going to be happy right now because today in this moment we had enough to eat. It's a feast.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so that's the beauty, is that you take a very poor family, and they don't feel poor because they are enjoying the time they have together. The money doesn't matter, because it's the time that they have together is more valuable. And so that's a lesson we learned from the Cratchit family, and that's what Scrooge learns too, is that he's like, okay, first of all, they seem happy and they're poor, and that's my fault. And he's like, and so he starts to get this inkling that he's like, maybe something I'm doing is wrong. And that's huge, because a lot of people, they don't really see uh their own fault in things. And so it's exciting that he starts to realize that he's like, maybe I should pay my clerk more, like, obviously.
Yeah. And hopefully he sees they're happy because they're together. And a large part of the reason he's unhappy is because he's utterly alone.
Right.
I don't think because he's not at all mindful, he's probably not given himself time to even think about that before.
Yeah,
That
absolutely.
maybe part of the reason I'm so dang miserable is because I'm alone, because he doesn't even stop to think that he is miserable. He won't acknowledge that, I'm sure,
Right. Scrooge
until
likes the
he's
cold.
right, until he sees the and even circumstances, they're laughing, they're happy. How can he not feel the joy of that moment and maybe be brought back to that happy time with Fezziwig and think, wait a minute, I experienced something like this once and it was nice.
Right.
Why did I let all that go? What happened? It's like his first moment of being in the moment and thinking, wow, I don't feel this, but I did once. What happened?
Right. Right. Exactly. And and that kind of helps us kind of segue into a little bit the the party at Fred's house that Scrooge was invited to but chose not to attend, where another example of mindfulness is that everyone there is having a great time. And they seem to be a more wealthy family, which is funny because Scrooge called him poor, but they're a
I
more
thought so too.
well-off family. And they're having a great time. They're playing games or with their friends. Everybody's having fun. Uh, Topper's chasing around this girl that he really likes, and they're playing basically Marco Polo. So one of them can't see, and and Topper's Marco Polo, so he can't see, but he finds a way to follow that one plump sister around the whole room, and everyone it says that people would like basically put themselves in his way to for him to be caught, and he would like pretend that he's trying to catch him, but still go after the sister. and and then Scrooge and Scrooge's nephew, and they have some fun. They eat and they play this game of basically yes or no questions, and it's at Scrooge's expense because Scrooge's nephew is being Scrooge, and people asked him, "Well, is it an animal?" And he says yes, and they're like, "Is he a bear?" And he says no, and then when they find out it's Scrooge, they're like, "Well, actually, I think that the answer that it's a bear should have been accepted," and so they have some fun at Scrooge's expense, all while Scrooge is there in spirit. And Scrooge enjoys every moment of it, and he wants to be there longer. He's in the moment and he's realizing it. He's like, you know what? This is actually really nice. He's like, and we find at the end of the book, he attends the party that he was invited to because he's like, you know, if you actually get out and you're with people, then you might actually enjoy yourself. And that's what he learns, is that being in the moment, putting yourself in good situations, that's a good idea. And he does that. And so that's something else that I think is cool, is that you get this sense of mindfulness from being with friends and family. Uh, and that helps you get out of your own kind of vicious cycles, like you were saying.
Yeah, it's funny. I think probably most of us have had that experience where sometimes you, need to go to a dinner or some kind of activity because you agreed to be there. But when it comes time to go, you don't really feel like it.
Right.
You want to stay home in your comfy clothes and keep watching the movie or playing a video game, whatever you're doing. You
Yeah.
just don't want to change like inertia. You want to stay at rest. You don't want to be in
Right. I
motion.
think it's a form of self-sabotage as well. Because
Oh
I get that.
yeah.
Yeah. I'm like, I
Yeah,
don't want to
maybe so.
go. But then you go and you have a good time.
Exactly. You go and you're like, wow, I'm so glad I came. Right. And so Scrooge is, experiencing that on a greater level, but I think we could all relate to him in some way. And
Right.
it's funny, that's something I noticed in the book that I hadn't really noticed before, was how much, even though they were kind of joking at his expense, he didn't mind. He was having a great time being there. And like you said, wanted to stay, you know? So I love how you can see him slowly transitioning, beginning the transition already. Like he enjoyed being with the
Right.
Cratches and he's enjoying being with his nephew. And like, it's like if his heart is some kind of icicle and it's starting to melt just a little
Hmm.
bit, and being in the moment and feeling something different and allowing himself to feel it is
Right.
great progress for him.
Yeah.
And that's one of the cool things about mindfulness. It doesn't really take much effort. I mean, you just have to try, but you get rewarded for a small amount of effort.
It's true. Yeah, I agree. And and I think, and it also helps Scrooge notice something near the end of Christmas Present. And this is a weird scene, but there's a line in here that's very telling of kind of what we're talking about. And so basically, Scrooge, he sees basically these two children that are representative of, as the ghost of Christmas Present says, he says, this boy is ignorance and this girl is want. Beware of them both, and all of their degree, but most of all, beware of this boy, for on his brow is written doom. And ignorance is the enemy of mindfulness, I think I would say, because if you're ignorant to something, then you're choosing not to acknowledge it. You're like, oh yeah, I just don't know what that is, so it's not my problem. And I think that's Scrooge to a T. And the Ghost of Christmas Future is doomed for Scrooge because he chose to be ignorant to the joy that Fred and his family was having. He chose to be ignorant to the plight of the Cratchits, and he chose to be ignorant to his own self-sabotage. And so he doomed himself to die alone and instead of people being sad that he died, people were happy. They partied. They were excited that he was dead because they didn't have to worry about the vicious debtor coming after him. And so the fact that he's noticing want and ignorance, and he's like, oh shoot, these are bad. He starts, I think this is a way of him kind of having some introspection and saying, I do this. I should stop doing this. What are your thoughts? Did you
Oh,
notice that same thing?
I think that's a great explanation of that because I wondered about that too, and I couldn't,
Right. It's the weirdest
really
part.
make sense of it. I'm like, because here he's having a nice time, and then suddenly there's this weird thing. So I
Right.
like the way you describe that. That makes sense. It's part of helping him, another way to help him see himself and his beginning to, yeah, that's very clever, Caleb. I like it.
Okay, well, good. So yes, so he realizes that he's like, okay, well, he's like, okay, so the present, I need to be more in the present. And I think that's what he's realizing. And then the Ghost of Christmas Present departs and leaves him, and he's left knowing that he now has to focus on the Ghost of Christmas Future, the ominous one, the dark road figure that we all fear. And I love how he's described as this dark figure, because we do all fear the future to a degree, but we don't need to. And that's what we're trying to learn here, is that the future doesn't have to be scary, but for so many of us, it is. And what we learn for Scrooge is that Scrooge's future, because he doesn't, in this version of his future, he didn't change his ways. And you see people celebrating that he died. You see people robbing literally the sheets and shirt off his back while he's dead. They take everything from his room while he's laying there. And they
Yeah,
just talk about how
even
much they're going to
like you
make
said,
from it.
the shirt he was wearing, I remember them talking about that. They're
Right.
like, you took the shirt off of him? She said, yeah, they were going to bury him in it.
Right.
That'd be a waste of a good shirt.
Right. You could look all day through this shirt and your eyes will never find a hole. Like, right.
That's so sad.
Yeah. And then but then it's you also learn that Scrooge's death didn't just affect himself negatively, obviously, but you also learned that he wasn't able to help out Tiny Tim. And so Tiny Tim dies because Bob Cratchit wasn't able to have the funds to be able to get him better attention effectively. And so Tiny Tim dies, and that's Scrooge's fault largely, especially now, because he's no longer ignorant to the fact that Bob Cratchit has a son who needs help. And so he doesn't help him and he dies. And that's largely on Scrooge because he could have done well. There's the famous quote that all that evil needs to succeed is for good men to do nothing. And Scrooge fits that to a T in this scenario, is that he could be a good man and he chooses to do nothing, and therefore bad things come of it. And that is what we fear in the future, is that if we are bad men and women, then bad things will happen, and that is bad. So but it's all about not being mindful. It's not saying he's not thinking about the future. He's thinking about just the money. He's not allowing him to say to himself to say, I wonder what will happen in the future if I change this. I don't know. What's your thoughts? I know mindfulness and focusing on the future is kind of they have a kind of weird relationship. It's not that you don't think about the future, but it's also not that you focus on the future. What would you have to say on that?
Right. Like, because that's what I mean about mindfulness being complex. You can say it very simply, be in the moment you're in, but it's actually also much more complicated than that. And I think a lot of it is not being avoidant. So if you're avoiding the future because you're scared, that doesn't mean you're being mindfully in the present.
Right.
Sometimes I think being mindful in the present is accepting the future. I think a lot of it is about acceptance and not avoiding those difficult feelings. Just that I feel like I'm like repeating myself, but not making it clear. Like I was
Well,
trying
it's like
to.
you're saying mindfulness is complex, but I like what you're saying that it's not about focusing on the future. It's about accepting the future. It's about realizing that the future will come and saying, you know what? Whatever happens, we're gonna deal with it. It'll work out.
Yeah,
I
and
think that's
not
kind of is that what
not
you're saying?
yeah, like when we say be in the moment you're in, means you don't think about the future as a way to avoid your present, but you also don't stay in the present to avoid the future. It's about acceptance,
Right.
and that acceptance is can be, really healthy and healing and help you deal with both your present, your future, your past, all of them together. It's powerful. Like I said, many, many books have been written on mindfulness. So
Right.
it's no
And the
surprise
Christmas
we
Carol.
can't quite put it, yeah, we can't quite put it into words as succinctly as we would
Yeah.
like to. But yeah, I think it has a lot to do with acceptance and not avoiding the future or the present or whatever. It's the best way I can say that.
Right. And I think that's what we learn from Scrooge too, is that he doesn't is that what he needs to learn is that the future is malleable, that he can change the future. So you don't need to fear the future. You need to acknowledge it. And if it's something that you're cool with, if you're like, hey, that's a future I like, then you keep on the same path you're going on. But if you're like, I don't want to be that man. I don't want to be the shirtless man on the bed with no sheets because people robbed them because no one respected him. But he realizes that he doesn't want to be that man, and so he realizes that he needs to change his ways. And he says to the ghost, he says, is this the representation of things as they will be or as they may be? And that is ultimately our fear of the future, is are things as they will be or as they may be. And so Scrooge, he's got this focus that he's like, okay, it's and so what he comes to is that it's as things may be, and I'm going to change the future. I'm going to make things better, and that is what a lot of people read this book for. Is the last few pages when Scrooge does his whole 180 and becomes a great man. All right, and now I remember you mentioned that there was some differences and some questions you had from the abridged version the to the full version. And so now, right before we wrap up, if you want to kind of maybe mention what you were thinking.
All right. So in the abridged version and even in the movie versions, always see change until right at the end when he saw how he was treated when he died. And then he's like, oh my gosh, I don't want to be like this. And suddenly he changed, which seemed kind of still selfish. And so I just couldn't understand it or see the change. But reading the extended version, then as we've talked about it, I could see more how the change started with with the present when he's with the Cratchits and with his nephew, but also with Christmas of Future. When he first sees that body, he doesn't know that that's him. And yet he feels compassion for this poor man, that they're treating him like this and that no one cares about him. And he's like, isn't there someone that cares about this man? And I think, on some level, I think he might have an idea that it's him, but he's not sure and he's feeling compassion. Remember, in the beginning, when the people asked him for money for the poor, he didn't want to think about that. He didn't want to think about other people's pain. So now he's allowing himself to feel pain, which is a true evolution for him. So I just thought, that just really helped me to read the full book to really see how Scrooge had evolved. And then
Yeah.
something else I thought of before we wrap up is, how we're talking about mindfulness doesn't mean that you avoid thinking about the future or that you be in the future to avoid thinking about the present. And the same thing with the past. It being, you know, I'm not, when I talk about not avoiding the past, I don't mean that you should dwell in the past either, but you find that balance. And like I said, that's why literally tons of books have been written on mindfulness because there's a lot to it. So I encourage our listeners, if they're interested, to look into mindfulness. It's just so powerful.
Yeah. No,
Mhm.
definitely. Yeah, mindfulness is really fascinating, and it's because it can have an effect on your life that could, in a sense, turn your life around, because it allows you to get in touch with yourself and be focused on what's really going on inside of you. That way you can be more deliberate in your actions. Um, and just kind of like Scrooge is at the end of the book. At the end of the book, he's a totally different person. And it's because he now realizes what he has been. He didn't realize that before. He was so focused on the money. He was so fixated on money that he didn't think about anything else. And then once he goes through
And
basically this,
fix,
yeah,
sorry for interrupting you,
no
but I
worries. Go
think
for it.
he was also focused on avoiding any kind of emotions.
Yes. No, that's true. Exactly.
Now he's allowing himself to feel. He wants to feel the happiness he felt at the Cratchits and at his nephews, and he wants to avoid the pain of what he saw potential future. And now he's feeling, though. That's a key thing, is that he's feeling.
Right. No, that's true. And it's because he did, in a sense, you could call this a mindfulness retreat, which for people who are into
Yes.
mindfulness, you know what that means. But that's really what this is it was a time where he set aside to focus on being mindful of and learning how to be more in the moment. And the the change that he goes through, he goes and immediately start, he's like, okay, I need to take care of the Cratchits. So he buys them the biggest goose. It, Charles Dickens says, there never was such a goose. He says, that thing couldn't have stood on his two legs or would have snapped right off, basically. And and then he talks, and then Scrooge is so excited because he's like, imagine Bob's face when they bring this goose to their door. And he's so
And he's
excited.
sending it anonymously.
Yes, anonymously.
So
He does so
sweet.
many things anonymously now. He's not focused on himself. And he runs across the same people that are looking for the charity, and he's like, oh, it kind of pained me to think about how they probably view me now, but I need to fix this. And so he goes and he whispers a number. We don't, even the readers, we don't know how much he donated, but they
That's
were
anonymous.
astonished. Right. Even the fictional future readers don't know what he did, but they were astonished. And Scrooge said, yeah, and there will be plenty of payments in the future. uh, and so they were all surprised. And then in the end, Scrooge, and now you don't usually see this in at least the movies I've seen, but Scrooge, he goes to the Cratchits, or sorry, in some of the movies you see him
To
go to the
Fred's.
Cratchits, right? And that's what I meant to say. But in some of the movies you do see him go to the Cratchits, which is inaccurate. He doesn't do that, but he goes to Fred's. He goes to Fred's and humbly asks if he could be a part of the celebrations. And of course, Fred is like, of course you can be here. You've always been welcome. And they're excited to have him. I'm sure they didn't have the same yes or no game of is it Scrooge, but
Right.
they probably still had a great time. And Scrooge probably smiled knowing that that would have happened if he hadn't been there. And then, and so Scrooge is so focused on others now. He's not just focused on himself, that even the next day he says that he got to the workhouse early so that he could hope that Bob Cratchit would be late. And it says that 9 o'clock comes around, no Bob. 9:15, no Bob. Half past, no Bob. And then it was like 9:45 or something. And then Bob shows up and he's he's working hard trying to overtake the time that he
Oh
missed.
yeah, like he had took off his hat before he even got in the door
Right.
and had his coat half off as he was coming in the door so he could hurry up and sit down and yeah,
Exactly.
that
He
was
knew that he
funny.
was late and he knew that he was in trouble and he was really hoping he wasn't going to be fired on the day after Christmas. And Scrooge, he kind of plays a little joke on him by acting like his old self and basically saying that he's like, you know what, this is unacceptable. You're fired. But he doesn't quite say fired. He says, I'm gonna have to rethink your situation. How about I raise your salary? And he starts laughing, and then Bob gets all like worried, and he's like, the book says that he thought about grabbing the ruler and knocking Scrooge down and calling for a constable because he thought that Scrooge had lost his mind. And but he didn't. He found it. He found his mindfulness. And so because of that, then he was able to be a good man and raised Bob's salary and was able to give him the money he needed to help with Tiny Tim. And Tiny Tim did survive. Tiny Tim lived, and all because one man was able to rethink the way he was doing things, realize the errors in his ways, and change and be better and improve those around him. Um, there's the famous line from, I think it's John Milton, where it's just no man is an island. And that's just so true, is that you don't, when you do something, you don't just affect yourself, you affect everybody around you. And Scrooge is a good example of this, is that when he was selfish, he hurt everybody around him. But when he was focused on others, then he was able to bless everyone around him. Like everybody was was a friend with him now. And maybe if you want to share some thoughts, I think I want to find a quote, but I'm sure you have some thoughts you want to share too. So what are you thinking?
Well, I was just thinking, we've talked a couple times, like, today and also in previous episode about Dickens and how he often mentions money. But I thought it was interesting that Scrooge is wealthy at the beginning of the story and he's wealthy at the end of the story. But the difference is just his overall attitude and the way he treats other people. So I think Dickens didn't necessarily have a problem with people having money. It's just the way the people, you know, with the money, how they treated those around them that were less fortunate
Right.
was really his point, you know? And I like how, speaking of the money thing, how he also, as we discussed, the money doesn't necessarily determine if you're happy or not. The Cratchits don't have money and they're happy. And the nephew has less money than Scrooge, but he's happy. And Scrooge, learns to be happy.
Right.
And none of it's about the money.
Yeah. And that is, it's all about the time and the people around you and the Christmas spirit of, giving to everybody, being there for somebody, just loving people. And so I'll read a quote and we'll wrap up this episode. But it says, Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became a good friend, a good master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough, in any good old world. Uh, and it says, some people some people laugh to see the alteration in him but he let them laugh, and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good, at which some people did not have their fill of laughter in the outset. And it says that his own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. And I just think that's just a really great paragraph. I skimmed through some of it, so read the book and you'll get all of it. But I just think it's great that he was better than his word. He did everything and infinitely more. He became a second father. He became a good man, and the whole town and all towns now knew him as this great person. Although he mentions that there were some that laughed at him, because now he was this guy that was giving away a lot of money, but he let them laugh. And he laughed in his own heart, and that was quite enough for him. Mindfulness is he allows himself to be mindful and to have an inner peace. And that's what he needed. He didn't worry about what people thought about him anymore because he laughed in his own heart, and that was enough for him. And I think that's kind of what sums up this book for me personally. What are your closing thoughts?
Oh, I think that's an excellent way to end it. I like what you said about the inner peace. I think that that is the goal of mindfulness, is to find that, to find that, to find the peace.
Right. And so this has been a great episode. I'm very grateful for any of you who have watched and enjoyed it. And I feel I would be amiss without making some note about how the the best way to find inner peace is through the Savior Jesus Christ. So it's I feel it'd be wrong to talk about a Christmas story without mentioning that in A Christmas Carol, the full version, it does talk about Christ a few times, and for good reason. And I don't think Christ should be left out of Christmas. So though we didn't talk about Christ explicitly throughout this episode, because we do want to be relatable and have a lot of people, we want to have people experience the podcast all the same. But the key is, especially during Christmas, is to focus on the Spirit of Christ and the love of Christ and the love of God towards all men. And as Tiny Tim says, God bless us, everyone. And I think that's my closing thoughts on it, is that let the Spirit of Christ into
Absolutely.
your life and it will improve every aspect of it.
Well said. I totally agree.
Great. Well, thank you all for listening, and we will hope that you will hear from us next time.